This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program News Analysis, now we bring you a discussion on decision on European Union carbon emission tax on flights of other nations. The participants are Rohit Bansal, Chief Executive Officer, India Strategic Group, and Shishir Sinha of The Hindu.
Namaskar. European Union Emission Trading System. That system which was supposed to be introduced from January 1, 2012 and later deferred to autumn 2013. Now a clear decision has emerged that there will be no unilateral imposition of this particular tax. What does this mean for air traveller? To talk on this issue, Mr. Bansal, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
This unilateral imposition, what does this mean for an air traveller, who is travelling from India to Europe?
Well, either India to Europe or via Europe into the United States or elsewhere, or sometimes even to Africa via European destination. Essentially, the idea of the European trade bloc, 28 countries which comprise the European Union, was that we should be saving the world, saving the planet, and airlines do comprise of certain carbon emissions which are harmful to the environment. There are estimates that about 2% of the total greenhouse gases in the world are due to the air travel industry. So therefore, people who are using air travel as a means of communication, transportation, should be paying. And that will be used for the betterment and the preservation of the planet. So they went ahead and, like you correctly pointed out, the deadlines for such taxes on airlines, which would have translated on a tax on you or me, would have happened. However, there is a very complicated architecture in the global aviation industry. Is the European Union, comprising 28 countries, sufficiently empowered to take a decision like this? And Shishir, even within Europe, it was not a unilateral or a consensual decision. Poland, for example, bats for coal-based industry, whereas the Nordic countries are into non-conventional energy, and they comprise the same multilateralized voice within one fora. So, within Europe, there is some creative tension on this subject, but to bring us to the case in point, at the International Civil Aviation Organization, this matter has been taken, and on Friday it has been therefore decided that no unilateral per se to Europe, though 28 countries comprise that unilateralism, will not be allowed to go ahead with this sort of plan, and therefore a subsequent timetable for action at a global platform has been at least talked about. The critics, as you will discuss with me later, are not that happy, but this is the way the airline architecture in the world is.
You talked about airline architecture or the aviation industry architecture. There are three organizations mainly involved into that. One is European Union, as you rightly said, and then there is the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, which is something called as a supreme body of the entire aviation government. And the third one is the IATA, International Air Travel Association. IATA has given some interesting figures. They said that out of 649 million tons of CO2 emitted by air travel last year, it is just 2% of the total global emission. Next thing they said that newer generation aircraft are as fuel efficient like small cars, burn just 3 liters per passenger kilometer. Then they also said that the 70% aviation emission per passenger kilometer are over 70% less than 1960s. And another thing which they said that 77% is the average aircraft occupancy, much higher than other form of the transport. How do you see this logic with the emission?
Fantastic question. IATA is the club of the airlines. They are a lobby group of the airlines, just as ICAO is a UN umbrella for the countries that are signatories to that. Almost everybody is now traveling. So even if the emission, instead of X, 20% less per person, that doesn't give you the whole picture. Because instead of 100x people, if 500x are now traveling, and in future, as we see the trends are, unless Skype takes over our whole lives, then we just stopped traveling and we stop tourism and we are happy just seeing the world on the internet.
The old way of traveling.
It is very unlikely that the actual total volumes of emission in the changed scenario where even middle class or lower middle class people in the domestic scenario at any rate have started traveling, and the rates are so predatory sometimes that it's cheaper even to travel overseas instead of within our own country. First of all, it is also a very high-profile industry. It cannot hide behind its responsibilities and say, oh, we have come down as compared to the 60s. What the societal expectation, Shishir, is that they will be doing a far better job than any other industry because they are the most highly visible one at that and is already a very popular consumer of the world's carbon resources or emissions.
And when this concept first came, not just Brazil, Russia, India or China, they opposed. Even the United States of America and some African country also opposed. But when this ICAO or ICAO, when that decision came, it was told that it's a victory for the BRIC countries.
I don't think that it is possible to call it a victory by BRICS countries. This is a normal brinksmanship. Here, the European Union Commissioner has also called it a victory, even though their proposal to have a regional taxation regime on you and me overflying Europe has been thrown out and has been made it part of an international architecture. 2016 has been set as the deadline for some kind of rules and then operationalizing.
That's a carbon trading system, yeah.
Right. So while their system has been actually stalled, it's like two litigants coming out with a stay and saying that both have won. So if BRICS is claiming victory, let me assure you even the European Union is claiming victory that the concept which they have come across, they've been talking about, has at least been taken on board, and therefore the implementation may have been grounded, but the idea has taken off.
European Union has another argument that this scheme is designed to cut emission by 20% by 2020. And on the other hand, airlines are saying that this will cost something around $21.2 billion over 8 years. How do you see these two arguments?
Well, we don't really know the numbers as they'll pan out because the UN panel, the ICAO, has agreed only on Friday. So the architecture is still, stuck in the weekend syndrome. We don't have all the details. But for sure, this is the first time that a single industry has committed itself to concrete steps to fight climate change. They do account for 2% of the greenhouse gas output, and they are looking to build a market-based mechanism that will monitor, report, verify airline carbon emissions, and the scheme will be implemented by 2020. So anybody who's coming out with very hard numbers as of now, I won't have my support for what it's worth. It has to come across as an intent, hopefully not merely a pious intent, but essentially the tension in aviation is also that it is not part of the World Trade Organization system. So you promised our listeners conversation on ICAO, IATA and EU. Here's the fourth guy. Why is aviation not part of WTO? That itself is a creative tension, and therefore is it not prone by implication to bilateral discussions which happen due to air services agreements being first discussed at the country-to-country level under the ICAO Chicago Convention Charter? Or is it therefore prone to regional trading agreements which the Europeans were trying to pose? And I think the US or India or China or Japan really fought for the coherence of the aviation system outside of the WTO, within the ICAO, and therefore bring out a mechanism. But the other point is that 2016 and 2020 look very far away, and they almost look like postponement of the problem, whereas there are serious risks to the Arctic. There are serious risks that it will become an ocean of water instead of ice. And within our lifetimes, in the next 15 to 20 years, this will increase the ocean levels and create havoc in various parts of the world, including our own coastlines.
Very good.
So it is not merely the 6 euros or 10 euros of tax that we seem to have avoided and we are very gung-ho about it, but the larger architecture where the only planet that we have has to be saved in a codependent sort of way. The Russians, who have said that we will stop flights overflying the Arctic Circle via the whole, this very efficient to fly longitudinally, but they have said that it won't work because if you're overflying certain areas you are by implication maybe doing only 2% in an overall national level, but the sort of concentration that happens around the polar caps because of efficiencies to fly over the Atlantic or between the US and the Western Europe in particular, that's the area where the maximum concentration of greenhouse emissions actually takes place without our realizing while we are watching a movie eating, we are actually making the Arctic warmer.
And we should not forget that flying or taking the alternative route also mean higher fuel consumption. That also mean higher emission. And when we talk about EU ETS, for the sake of our listeners, it means that airlines will have to report emission data and pay if emission exceeds certain limit. Now, coming to the overall airline industry, the kind of financial situation they are facing, do you think that any kind of new burden on that? Because one thing is very clear, when you are paying tax, when an airline is paying tax, it's not going to absorb itself. It will simply pass it on to the consumer. Are they in a position to pass it on to the consumer? Especially I'm talking about the Indian airline situation.
Well, before I take on the Indian airline situation, it will be useful to know that the Kyoto Protocol, which is the basic trading system that was discussed around 1997, has a distinction between international aviation and domestic aviation. So the emission from international aviation was specifically excluded from targets read in the Kyoto Protocol, and emissions from domestic aviation are included. So there is a minor issue which we need to have flagged here. Well, that your airlines are broke, are inefficiently managed, are overstaffed, are not necessarily even futuristically, the capital usage is extremely inefficient, is no excuse to say that they cannot the rightful payers of the destruction to the environment that they are partners in. Nature of the game is to overfly areas, emitting your gases, becoming slightly more efficient because of your new Dreamliners or whatever. But if the total number of flights take northward bias, then you have to take your responsibility. You cannot say that the polluter pays principle does not work on airlines because we are not doing well. There can be other sectors which will have a equally compelling argument. Therefore, cement could be one, we are making buildings, we are constructing bridges besides us if there are no roads. So therefore, we should not be committing ourselves to reduction of greenhouse gases. I think then we are out for sure destruction of the world, and I think Mr. Al Gore's film should be seen by every child while growing up before you even think about the polluter pays principle to be becoming a hostage of the polluters' so-called economic problems.
And one of the positive, as a last question, one of the positive of the entire controversy is that it has given an opportunity for Indian airlines, all the aviation companies, to have newer, better technological aircraft so that the emission is much lesser and they can contribute in the global war against a kind of climate change or the global warming we are talking about. Don't you think it has given an opportunity, say for 3 year or 6 year, to equip themselves to have better aircraft, to have more advanced aircraft rather than just relying on the old ones?
That's not going to be the only driver of new
That's
technology.
one of the positive, yeah.
Yes, if airline passengers start demanding that I will not go on this completely wretched piece of equipment and that is not even good for the environment and not necessarily for my pocket. There's a linkage between pocket and perception. I am all for it. But typically what people do is to essentially not even know what kind of equipment they are going to fly on.
They can't make a difference between 737-800 or 737-900.
I think they do not even know that how much overflying is going on, what type of route navigation is inefficiently organized, and therefore a lot of factors are not even known to us. We only look for the food on cabin as well as the games and on the video console. But I think there is a case for the airline industry to pull up its socks and realize that that's the minimum societal expectation of those who are on the ground, not necessarily those who are flying with them. And that is an opportunity. There could be even labeling, there could be ratings of airlines, and we'll be there.
So there are some positives for the airlines industry as well as for we can work for the controlling the emission thing. With this, we have to come to. And thank you, Mr. Bansal, talking to us.
Thank you, Shishir.
You were listening to a discussion on decision on European Union carbon emission tax on flights of other nations. The participants were Rohit Bansal, Chief Executive Officer, India Strategic Group, and Shishir Sinha of The Hindu. It came to you in the program News Analysis, Produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.